Carlos walked quickly through the streets of his neighborhood, his body exhausted after another day of work at the warehouse. Night was falling, and he wanted to get home quickly to rest next to his mother, Donna Ruth, and his sister, Leticia. The sound of traffic and the city seemed distant in his mind, which was still absorbed in the tasks he had completed. He took a deep breath, enjoying the silence of the streets, when a police car suddenly appeared on the corner, stopping abruptly next to him. Before he could understand what was happening, the car door opened and 2 police officers quickly got out, looking stern. Carlos stood still, trying to control the anxiety that was beginning to grow inside him. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped, but something seemed different now. He tried to remain calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Do you know what's going on, kid?" the older cop asked, his hand already on his gun. His tone was harsh, impersonal. Carlos felt his stomach churn, but he tried to answer in a firm voice. "I was just going home, officer. No big deal." The other, younger police officer began to rummage through Carlos's pockets without ceremony. Finding nothing, he looked at the older one, who then frowned and stared at Carlos. "You're the guy who robbed the electronics store, aren't you?" The older police officer said dismissively. Carlos tried to protest. "I didn't steal anything. I work all day at the warehouse. I didn't do anything wrong." But his words were interrupted by a violent punch to the jaw. The impact was so strong that Carlos barely had time to balance himself. He staggered backwards before falling to the asphalt, his head hitting hard. The second police officer grabbed him by the shoulders and lifted him up, while the first punched him once more, this time in the stomach. Each blow seemed ironic and meaningless, but Carlos could do nothing but try to protect his body. The pain was unbearable, and he began to lose consciousness. But before he passed out, one single sentence kept repeating in his mind. "Why is this happening to me?" All he wanted was to get home. But at that moment, he didn't know that his life would never be the same again. When he finally passed out, the world around him became a dark haze, a void of pain and fear. He couldn't know it, but he was about to fall into a deep coma that would cut him off from the real world. His mother, Donna Ruth, didn't know what was happening to her son. And when the police finally took him away, with his eyes already lifeless, the pain was just beginning for everyone who loved him. News of Carlos's attack spread quickly through the neighborhood. Donna Ruth, his mother, was in the kitchen when the phone rang. Her heart raced as soon as she answered it, fear spreading like wildfire through her chest. "It's about Carlos." The voice on the other end of the line was tense. He was assaulted by the police. He's in the hospital, and he's in a coma." Donna Ruth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The words seemed to echo distantly, as if she were hearing them from another reality. The phone slowly slipped from her hands as she fell to her knees on the cold floor, panic taking over her body. Wasting no time, she grabbed a coat and ran to the hospital, the city streets becoming a blur as anguish tightened her chest. Arriving at the hospital, she was greeted by a doctor who seemed to weigh every word. "Your son's condition is serious. We are doing everything we can, but the impact to his head was severe. He is in an induced coma. We need to wait." Donna Ruth sat on the bench in the waiting room, tears falling silently. She didn't know what else to do. She didn't even know how to deal with the pain of seeing her son at the mercy of the system that had always distrusted people like him. Meanwhile, at the police station, Carlos's story took on a new dimension. The police officers who attacked him maintained their version of events. He had been responsible for the robbery at the store, and so their aggressive approach was justified. For them, it was all a simple case of justice being served. The case was quickly referred to Judge Oliveira, a 55-year-old man known for his tough and uncompromising stance. In the past, he had been praised for his relentless sentencing. especially in cases involving young people from peripheral neighborhoods like Carlos's. For the judge, justice was clear. If the accused belonged to a certain profile, he was guilty. There was no room for doubt or questioning. "We're going to move forward with this immediately," Judge Oliveira told the prosecution's attorney before even hearing any defense testimony. Carlos's case seemed to him to be just another in a long line of young people convicted simply because of where they came from. While the judge made his cold and distant decisions, Donna Ruth did not know what the future held for her son, but she knew one thing: she would fight for Carlos, no matter what the cost. The soft sound of monitors and respirators filled the cold hospital room. The dim morning light streamed in through the window, but Carlos's world was still in darkness. His body lay motionless, strapped to the bed by tubes and wires. His normally vibrant face was pale, almost unrecognizable. The marks of punches and fighting still left their mark on his skin. Donna Ruth spent her hours beside her son, her eyes fixed on him, as if just by looking at him she could wake him up. She whispered words of hope, memories of the good times, of birthday parties, of Sunday mornings when Carlos sang beside her in the kitchen, still a child, with the innocence of someone who did not know the weight of the world. "You'll wake up, son," she repeated, more to herself than to him. "I know you will. You've always been strong." But time passed and nothing happened. The visits from doctors and nurses were brief and cold, as if the agony of waiting were just another procedure. They had no clear answers, just more tests, more observations. The prognosis was not good, but Donna Ruth refused to accept what she was being told. Meanwhile, the city moved on. The violence against Carlos had become a story that everyone told, but there was something distant and impersonal about it. The police assault case was being quickly dismissed, with the officers involved claiming that there had been no excesses in their actions. It was a standard approach, they said. The defense attorney, a man with ties to powerful interests, seemed to be working tirelessly to cover up any evidence that might point to abuse of power. On a Tuesday night, after a week of complete silence, something unusual happened. Carlos began to move his toes. First, a small movement in his left foot, like an involuntary reflex. Mrs. Ruth, upon seeing this, felt a surge of hope and excitement. She called the nurses, who arrived immediately, but the movement did not repeat itself. It was then, in the middle of the night, that something even more surprising happened. Carlos opened his eyes slowly, with a vague glow in his eyes, as if he were trying to find some reality around him. Mrs. Ruth, who was sleeping in a chair next to the bed, woke up to the sound of a faint sigh. When she looked at her son, Carlos's eyes were fixed on her. "Mom." The word came out with difficulty, but it was enough to break the heavy silence in that room. Tears fell from Donna Ruth's eyes. She didn't know what else to say. Joy mixed with fear filled her heart. Her son was back, but he would never be the same. None of us would be. The shock of the attack and the pain of what had happened were etched into her mind and body in a way that no one could erase. Carlos looked at her, weak but with a determined expression. "I remember," he began, his voice shaking. "I remember what they did to me." Mrs. Ruth didn't know what to say. All she wanted at that moment was to hug her son and assure him that he would not suffer anymore. But she knew that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. Carlos was awake, but the real battle was just beginning. Carlos's awakening was a sign of hope, but also of great anguish. He was conscious, but the shock of the violence and the painful memories of how he had been treated by the police had left deep scars on his soul. Mrs. Ruth knew that her son's recovery process would be much more complex than simply healing from his physical wounds. Carlos had become, in some way, a victim not only of brutality, but also of a system that was unwilling to acknowledge the pain of people like him. In the days following his awakening, Carlos was transferred to a rehabilitation center where he began to face the harsh reality of his situation. He needed physical therapy to regain movement, but perhaps even more challenging was the psychological struggle he faced every day. "How are you, son?" Donna Ruth would ask softly when she visited him in his new accommodation. She would watch Carlos, always immersed in his own thoughts, trying to find a way to deal with the trauma. I don't know how I am," Carlos replied, his eyes reflecting deep pain. "I just want justice. I want people to know what they did to me. I didn't deserve this." Carlos's words were a mixture of anger and despair, and Donna Ruth didn't know how to comfort him. She knew her son was right, but she also knew that the fight would be hard and that the truth would hardly be heard. Meanwhile, the city was beginning to reel with the echoes of Carlos's violent experience. The story was covered by local newspapers, but as expected, the headlines were filled with a distorted narrative. "Young man involved in robbery beaten by police" was how the newspapers portrayed the events. Carlos's own name had been obscured, replaced by a criminal label, and the police presented themselves as the heroes of the story. Donna Ruth couldn't understand how the system could be so cruel. She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know where to start. That's when a lawyer named Rafael came to her. He was willing to take on the system and help Carlos, not only to seek legal redress, but to bring the truth to light. "I want your son to know he is not alone. I will not let this be swept under the rug. They will have to pay," Rafael said firmly. Donna Ruth looked at him, grateful but also filled with apprehension. She knew she would face many obstacles. The justice system was tied by its own corruption, and the police officers involved in her assault were protected by a network of powerful influences. But she also knew that she could not stand by and wait for things to resolve themselves. The fight for the truth would begin there, with her and Carlos facing a path that would be long and difficult. Carlos, although wounded, found in Rafael a spark of hope. He was determined to fight, not only for his own dignity, but for the dignity of all those who were invisible to the eyes of those in power. He knew that his case was only a reflection of a much greater reality, and that he had a responsibility to face it. He looked at his mother and said with more conviction, "Let's fight, Mom. I won't let them silence me." The process was in motion, but Carlos's battle was just beginning. The pressure of fighting an entire system was immense, but he felt more and more that his voice needed to be heard. Donna Ruth, by his side, was more determined than ever. She knew that although Carlos was recovering physically, the real pain was in his soul, and it was this pain that she needed to help heal. Lawyer Rafael wasted no time. He began preparing for a civil lawsuit, challenging the official narrative that had been imposed on Carlos. He knew the legal path would be tortuous, but he also knew there was no way to ignore what had happened. This was a matter of humanity, and he was willing to see it through to the end. "Let's focus on what really matters, the truth," Rafael said to Donna Ruth. "The defense will try to discredit us, but we have the evidence. We will not allow Carlos's case to be just another statistic." While the lawyer was preparing his strategy, tension in the streets was growing. The indignation of some citizens was mixed with the indifference of others. Carlos' story spread across social media, and soon a support campaign began to gain momentum. Protests began to form, demanding justice for the young man who had been attacked by the police. But behind this movement were the ghosts of prejudice and discrimination, which many tried to silence. Carlos was aware of the public repercussions of his case, but he could not let it get to him. The pressure of being the face of a larger struggle weighed heavily on his shoulders. He knew he could not be just a victim. He needed to be a symbol. The weight of responsibility consumed him. On the eve of the first day of the trial, Carlos had a heart-to-heart talk with Donna Ruth. He was sitting on the bed in the rehabilitation center, still having difficulty moving easily, but with a clear and determined mind. "Mom, do you have any idea what we're doing means?" Carlos asked, his eyes fixed on her. "Yes, my son. I know what it means," Donna Ruth replied, stroking his hair. "We are not just fighting for you, we are fighting for all who have been silenced. You are not alone." Carlos nodded, emotion rising in his throat. He had never imagined that the pain he felt could turn into a collective scream. He looked out the window, seeing the horizon outside, and thought about the future. He thought about what would come after the fight. The first day of the trial arrived with a suffocating intensity. The courtroom was packed, and the tension was palpable. News cameras were everywhere, recording every move, every word spoken. Donna Ruth, sitting in the front row, held hands with Carlos, who stood firm, although his body was still fragile. He was no longer just facing the police officers who had beaten him, he was facing the system that had for so long considered him invisible. The police officer's defense attorney, an arrogant man, began his presentation with a cold and impersonal demeanor. Carlos, the defendant, was involved in criminal activity and resisted arrest. The police action was a necessary reflex to ensure the safety of the community, he argued, with the coldness of someone who already knew that the justice system often favored those who wore the uniform. What happened next, however, was something no one expected. Rafael, Carlos' lawyer, stood calmly, his eyes fixed on the judge. He knew he had to be careful, as any mistake could be fatal to the case. But he also knew that there was something that could change everything: the truth. "Your Honor," Rafael began, his voice firm and calm, "what happened here was not a legitimate police action. What happened here was an abuse of power, an abuse that was hidden by the very institutions that were supposed to protect him. The proof of this is in the images and the testimonies, and most importantly, it is in the pain that Carlos experienced, a pain that he carries to this day. He was not treated like a criminal, he was treated like a statistic." Donna Ruth felt the weight of Rafael's words. She knew that this was the crucial moment, the moment that could change everything for Carlos. He was no longer just fighting for his own freedom. He was fighting for a greater cause. And despite her fear and anxiety, she knew that justice would be served. But the path ahead was still full of obstacles. The battle had just begun. The courtroom was tense as the defense presented its arguments, trying to undermine Carlos's credibility and his version of events. But attorney Rafael was determined. Every word he uttered seemed to touch the hearts of those present, even those on the prosecution's side. With each new detail, he made it clear that Carlos's case was not a simple case of resisting arrest, as they tried to make it seem. It was much deeper, more complex. It was about abuse of power, about a system that did not see certain citizens as human, but as obstacles to be overcome. The next morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was even more tense. The public was anxious, and Carlos's case had attracted considerable media attention. A crowd of journalists were there, waiting for more revelations about the case. However, no one expected what would happen next. The hearing was about to resume when the defense attorney, a man named Dimas Souza, called a recess. He stood up abruptly and addressed the judge, demanding that new testimony be presented. All eyes were now on him, curious to see what he would bring to the table. "We have new information that needs to be revealed, information that is crucial to the resolution of this case," he said, with a calmness that contrasted with the anxiety that filled the room. The judge, his patience already at its limit, looked at him with a disconcerting expression. "What's wrong with you, Dr. Souza?" he asked, visibly skeptical. But Dimas was undeterred. He looked around the room and, with a dramatic gesture, pointed to the courtroom door. "I want you to see this." With the judge's permission, Demas brought someone unexpected into the courtroom, a young man who looked nervous and somewhat out of place. He was visibly uncomfortable with so many eyes on him. But what really made everyone crouch in surprise was the fact that the young man, upon entering the room, looked directly at Carlos. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine when he saw him. It couldn't be him. The man before him looked like a younger, more nervous version of someone he'd known for a long time. Something in his face, in the way he moved, told him there was a connection he didn't understand. "Who is he?" Donna Ruth whispered, her voice full of concern. Carlos, with his eyes fixed on the man, felt the weight of an inexplicable fear. The defense attorney, seeing the confusion in the room, got straight to the point. "This young man is Lucas, the son of the police officer responsible for Carlos's assault," he said, breaking the tense silence that had taken over the room. The impact of these words was devastating. The room fell into absolute silence as all eyes turned to the young man, who now seemed even more uncomfortable under the disapproving gazes. Carlos felt his heart beat faster, and his hands, which had previously been steady, began to sweat. How was this possible? The son of a police officer. He looked at his mother, who was equally astonished. Lucas, visibly nervous, took a step forward, his voice shaking as he began to speak. I can't keep seeing what my father did, what he did to Carlos. It's not right. I'm a part of it, and it eats away at me," Lucas said, almost in a whisper. Donna Ruth, who until then had been sitting, paralyzed by what she was hearing, finally stood up, her expression a mixture of anger and sadness. "Did you know all this? Did you know your father was capable of this?" she questioned, her voice cracking with emotion. Lucas shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "No, I didn't know. I grew up believing he did the right thing. But now I see that he abused his power. I can't keep quiet any longer." The young man looked torn, his face contorted by the internal pain that consumed him. He was aware that his revelation could destroy his father's life, and at the same time, he felt he needed to be honest. The weight of carrying the secret of the violence committed against Carlos had become unbearable. Carlos, still in shock, didn't know what to think. He looked at Lucas and then at the defense attorney, trying to understand what all this meant. Would the truth finally come out? Or was this just another attempt at manipulation? The judge, still reeling from the revelation, motioned for everyone to calm down. "This testimony is significant. We will proceed with caution," he said, before ordering the court to adjourn for a while. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Carlos felt a sense of relief mixed with a sense of disorientation. He knew something had changed, but what that meant for him, for his mother, and for the future of his fight was still uncertain. The pain of humiliation was far from gone, but now he felt that the truth was finally coming out. The courtroom was in turmoil. The revelation of Lucas, the son of the police officer involved in the assault, had shaken the foundations of the case. Carlos felt a mix of emotions as he watched the chaos unfold around him. On the one hand, he felt that something fundamental had changed. On the other, the weight of the discovery still weighed on him. How could he trust the justice system if his adversary was somehow linked to the very blood of the person he was trying to challenge? During the break, Carlos stepped away from the crowd. Sitting in the wings of the courtroom, he watched his mother's face, which seemed to be unsure of what to think. She had always known that the system was broken, but the fact that even the son of one of the men who had assaulted him was standing up against the injustice was an unexpected twist. The situation became even more complex as the pieces moved on the board. Donna Ruth approached him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Carlos, are you okay?" His voice was shaking, but there was a gleam of hope in his eyes. "This could be our chance." Carlos looked at her, but his thoughts were scattered. He knew Lucas was fighting an equally difficult emotional battle. Like him, Lucas was caught between loyalty to his family and the need to do the right thing. But would it be enough? The truth, despite all the pain it caused, needed to be embraced by everyone involved. It wouldn't just be Lucas's confession that would change everything, but everyone's willingness to accept reality and act accordingly. I don't know what to think, Mom, Carlos said, his voice breaking. This is all happening so fast. Donna Ruth took a deep breath, trying to bring some clarity to her son's confusion of feelings. Sometimes, change comes from where we least expect it. But our fight is not just yours. It's all of ours, and Lucas has a voice too. When the courtroom reopened, the atmosphere was more tense than ever. The judge, with a serious demeanor, made a point of ordering the witnesses to prepare for their testimony, but before that, Lucas was called back to the witness stand. He seemed even more nervous, but his determination was clear. It was as if, at that moment, he was ready to face the weight of his own conscience. Mr. Lucas, what brought you into the public eye? The defense attorney asked, his tone cautious but inquisitive. I can't stay silent anymore. I saw what happened to Carlos, and I know my father did something terrible. What he did wasn't fair, Lucas replied, his voice now firmer but still visibly shaken. Carlos observed everything carefully. He knew that Lucas was taking an important step, perhaps the most important of his life. However, the gravity of the situation made him question whether he would really be able to change the course of the case. A revelation alone would not be enough. He needed more. He needed the system to actually listen to him and recognize the error. However, the prosecution and defense attorneys had their own plans. The prosecution's strategy now was to turn the narrative around. They presented the testimonies of other officers, trying to discredit Lucas's testimony, claiming that his opinion was biased due to his personal involvement. The tactic was clear: to try to manipulate the trial and discredit any argument that contradicted the official story. Mr. Judge, this is an attempt to distort the facts. Lucas's testimony is clear. He is not here to protect his father, but to defend the truth. Rafael, Carlos's lawyer, quickly countered. The judge, tired of so many attempts at manipulation, paused dramatically before making an important decision. He rose from his chair, his gaze fixed on the lawyers and witnesses, and spoke in a deep voice. This case is not about who is right or wrong, but about the search for truth, and truth cannot be stifled by blood relations or loyalty. This court will decide the future based on facts, not personal interests. Carlos felt a wave of relief. The judge, it seemed, was ready to put his emotions aside and follow the line of justice. But deep down, he still felt the weight of the entire process. The feeling of humiliation and pain that accompanied him would not go away easily. Even with the possibility of a victory, the road to get there would be arduous. The session was postponed until the following day. Everyone involved knew that what happened from that moment on would have immense repercussions. The final decision would not only be about Carlos's life, but about a part of the system that could finally be dismantled. As Carlos and his mother walked out of the courthouse, the cool night wind seemed to bring a sense of renewal. But inside Carlos, there was a whirlwind of feelings. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing he knew for sure: he was no longer fighting alone.